You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory.
D-Day. You've probably heard of it if you know anything about World War II. One of the most well-known and biggest amphibious assaults in history, where the Western Allies kick in the door on Hitler's Germany and attempt to liberate Western Europe once and for all. Now, there was a lot of planning that went into this invasion, and the Western Allies need to make sure that it was done right and properly, as they know that they may not get a second chance to do this invasion over again. They had to pick a section of beaches that they wanted to attack. They had to figure out what units would do that attack, and so on. And today, we're going to talk about that and how it applies to Hell Let Loose. The important and historical aspects, the objectives and what they mean historically, the units that were used in this battle, and talk about a lot of different aspects and how they are shown in Hell Let Loose in a historical analysis. Now, before we get into Hell Let Loose's Utah Beach, let's go over some context leading up to D-Day. Now, throwing a map up here just to show off a couple things here. This is the state of Europe in 1944, right before D-Day. On the right-hand side, you have the USSR and their current advances right before Operation Bagration, which is set to happen June 22nd, 1944, exactly 3 years after the invasion of the Soviet Union, or Operation Barbarossa, back in 1941. In the south, you have the Italian campaign, which has been very slow-moving, and still would be until the end of the war. The latest action that happened there was the Battle for Monte Cassino, which was very mixed in terms of really what it accomplished. Field Marshal Kesselring was able to escape thanks to the Allies going for Rome instead of crushing Kesselring where they had him. And Field Marshal Kesselring was able to retreat and keep the Allied advance very slow going through Italy. A second front had to be made, and that's where D-Day comes in. So, the Germans, knowing that an invasion was bound to happen, and one had happened earlier, 2 years earlier at Dieppe, which was a major failure for the Allies. The Germans had constructed the Atlantic Wall, which stretched from the Spain-French border all the way in the south, all the way from the northern bits of France to the Low Countries to northern Germany, Denmark, all the way to northern Norway. This was made to help keep the Allies out. Any invasion across this entire front in Western Europe would be met with heavy casualties, no matter how they sliced it. So it was important that if they were going to do an invasion, they had to do it right and at the right place at the right time. The Atlantic Wall, although very impressive on the surface, had some definite flaws, and the Western Allies would have the advantage in a lot of these categories. The first thing being the troop quality. The troop quality guarding the Normandy coast was not the best, to put it lightly. A lot of the good troops that had once guarded this area were siphoned off to places like the Eastern Front to fill up the losses that were happening there. The remaining troops were a mix of unnotable men, Osttruppen or foreign Eastern auxiliary troops that were pressed into service by the Germans in the conquered territories, or just men that were very unnotable. These troops were not the best, as you could expect. Their weapons also reflected this, having a mix of German, French, and other captured weapons that they could fill for their armories. On top of that, Rommel did not have a lot of what he wanted in terms of panzer divisions for the coastline and the defenses he needed, as both resources and manpower were very limited to him. So building up these defenses exactly what he wanted was never going to happen. And on top of that, with the panzer divisions spread all across the Atlantic Wall and not necessarily centered in any particular defense pattern for Rommel's sake, it would make defense a lot harder for him. The Allies launching these attacks didn't exactly make Rommel's life any easier. They had a major advantage in terms of air power, because at this point the Luftwaffe was really a shell of its former self. Although still potent, they didn't possess the numbers or advantage that they once had, and a lot of their planes were on the Eastern Front, not the Western Front. Secondly, the Allies did a major deception campaign, using both the French resistance and the U.S. First Army Group commanded by Patton, which was an entirely decoy army made to make it look like that they are going to invade Calais instead of Normandy. Thirdly, the Russians were going to launch a major attack against the Germans, Operation Bagration, on June 22nd, as I've already mentioned. This attack would effectively shatter Army Group Center and lead to the destruction of Army Group North in the long run. And Army Group South would get pushed out of Romania. So, combine all this, the Germans weren't exactly having a good time. So it's just important to know that there were a lot of disadvantages for the Germans and a lot of advantages for the Allies, but even then, it still wasn't set in stone. Moving on to Utah Beach itself, we had the German 709th Infantry Division, which consisted of men I've already listed, unnotable men, Osttruppen, and older Germans, where weapons of varying nations filled their stores, but they did have some decent leadership. The troops facing the Germans would be the 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, and the 4th Infantry Division. The airborne divisions would be dropped behind enemy lines, would be scattered a lot all over the place in Normandy, but they would accomplish a lot of their objectives, forming ad hoc or makeshift units to conquer objectives, such as destroying AA guns and artillery positions. And overall, their casualties would be actually really high compared to the beaches, at about 2,500 troops, compared to the 4th Division's casualties, which were only in the couple hundreds, just for context. Overall, most of the objectives were taken care of. The only major objective that wasn't met on day one of the invasion was isolating the Cherbourg Peninsula, or the peninsula that the deepwater port town of Cherbourg was on. Other than that, most of the objectives were taken, and thousands of troops were able to land basically unopposed after the first couple of hours. And thousands of troops were able to get on the beach, as well as hundreds if not thousands of vehicles. Which sets the scene now for a video talking about Utah Beach and Hell Let Loose and how it stacks up in a historical sense. So this is the best map I could find that outlined a lot of the objectives. Overall, the map as a whole, even in game sense and a map sense, fits the landscape pretty well even to today's standards, even with 70, 80 years of change. So this is a modern map of the area. As you see, the major road near La Madeleine that goes up through the middle, the river, and I'll outline this, of Lagrange Creek, which is what it's called, and overall just the beaches itself. There'll also be a picture of Red Roof House I'll include in there. The major objectives we're going to talk about is Terre Green, Red Roof House, Uncle Red, WN7, WN5, WN4, the area around Chapel, St. Mary Approach, Lagrange Creek, and that's really about it. A lot of the other objectives, there may be some stuff we touch on a little bit, but there may not be a lot to really go off of. Kind of like in my Stalingrad video, where there's just certain objectives there isn't much to touch on, and might be more in there for gameplay reasons. But overall, the map as a whole stacks up pretty well to the modern area, and with some minor changes, but it looks good all around. So we'll start with the beach and work our way up the coastline. So as you can see, we see a bunch of ships of varying classes. We have destroyers, we have heavy cruisers, we got battleships, all of which were present during the D-Day landings, doing a simple bombardment. Nothing actually happens in game, they're just merely for show. Moving on from that, we have the landing craft or the Higgins boats that you can actually come in on. Now, you can only really come in on these on the offensive game mode if you're the Americans. If you're playing on warfare mode, you don't get this, unfortunately, but they're still present. Then you move into the beach where it's got all its defenses, the shell craters, the barbed wire, and the bunkers. And that's where we move into the 3 objectives of note. We have Terre Green, Red Roof House, and Uncle Red. So, like the beaches themselves of Utah Beach, Omaha, Sword, and those are designations that the beaches were called. They're not just called Utah Beach just because they're called Utah Beach. These were designations that the Western Allies gave these beaches. These beaches had even more complicated designations of the section of beaches, these two being Terre Green and Uncle Red. And these aren't the only two. All the beaches got their designations, such as the ones in Omaha. You can even see on the Omaha map, such as Dog Green and Dog White, just to name 2 examples on another map that we'll get to soon. But those are 2 objectives of beach that were to be landed on. Red Roof House, which was in the middle of these two sections of beach, was a marker that was used by the Allies, just in general. And to this day, actually stands today, as you saw in the picture I showed earlier, and can be visited today at Normandy. So we're going to move inland a little bit now and talk about the WN positions. These are WN4, WN5, and WN7 that we're going to talk about today. So what are these positions? Well, these were major resistance areas or strong points in the German defense line at the coastline. So these were Widerstandsnetzen, or resistance nests, translated from German, that the Germans made along their defense both at the coastline and slightly beyond the coastline for any invading force to contend with. These defenses consisted of bunkers, Tobruk gun positions, whether they were by MG or recycled tank turrets from old French tanks, barbed wire, anti-tank traps, and so on. And they were usually garrisoned by platoon-strength units. At Utah Beach in particular, there was 9 of these positions. And as far as I could tell, these positions were accurately placed as far as can be seen, but I digress. With WN4 and WN7 in particular, they were basically part of a German strategy of if they managed to get off the beach, the problems wouldn't end there, and they would be strong points that they could use to maybe throw the Allies back. This is more seen at Omaha Beach, since there are only so many ways to get off the beach at Omaha through the draw, which is actually an objective in game that you can see. There's only so many places you get off there, and the same principles apply to those since they're not on the coastline. And they're a lot more fortified than the coastline defenses. They're basically tiny fortresses, as shown in game. So those positions were made if the Western Allies broke through, and so those positions could hold until reinforcements could arrive. Continuing on, we're going to talk about the area around Chapel. So if you look on a modern map, we can see the road that's going north to south, pretty accurate to what we have in game, and then the 4-way intersection that passes right by where the WN7 objective would be. So in a modern perspective, this is actually pretty good, and compared to the in-game map. The only thing different is we don't have a road that goes to the west towards Lagrange, but 70 to 80 years have gone by, the landscape has definitely changed, and, well, the war went through it. I managed to find what I think is a photo of the chapel used in game. We can see the hedgerows and just the chapel as a whole. This isn't 100% sure, but this was the closest thing I could find. So take it with a grain of salt, but this is what the chapel looked like after the Allies liberated it. Finally, we have the last 2 objectives we're going to talk about today. I'm throwing them all in one pile since there's not really much to talk about them. So Lagrange Creek, Drowned Fields, and St. Mary Approach. So in Lagrange, there's a river that runs through this area and runs pretty accurate to what a today map would say about them. So the maps I've used, you can see them. I've already mentioned them. There's just nothing really there anymore. There's no major road. There may have been one once before, but I couldn't really confirm that. It just seems to be a gameplay area, not a historical one, but it would make sense as an area as it would be a choke point over a river or a creek. Moving down to Drowned Fields. Overall, I don't know if this position is accurate either, necessarily, but the Germans did do this. To limit certain avenues that the Allies could use to get off the beach in the event they did, they flooded some of the fields to prevent their movement. And finally, we have St. Mary Approach. This road, if you continue on it, will lead you to St. Mary du Mont, which is another map we're going to cover and another important objective for the Allies that the Airborne was part of. So if you take that road all the way down, you'll get to St. Mary du Mont. So that's the important part of that objective there. Now changing the subject a little bit, talk about a little bit about the weapons. Overall, the weapons that were used at this battle that we see in game are all accurate. The only tank that wouldn't necessarily have been present at this battle would have been the E2 Sherman, or the M4A3 E2 Jumbo Sherman. The main reason why we wouldn't see the M4A3 E2 Heavy Sherman was because they weren't ready yet. The earliest that the U.S. Army could get them was August of 1944, which would have been a month after D-Day. Combine this that there really wasn't that many made of the E2 Sherman, only a couple hundred, compared to the E8 or the other variants that the Sherman was made of. So the E2 wouldn't have been the most historically accurate tank to go with, but I digress. The historical accuracy for Utah Beach, both looking at it from whatever historical documents could be used to even today, is astonishing. The developers really did their homework on this map, and they showed it off well in their game. Even with some aspects that are obviously put in for gameplay reasons, like any map would have, they show a very good care to make sure that it's not just a random map that they make up halfway through. They took the real landscape and did the best they could to model that in game, which I can applaud them for. And the gameplay of it all is good. You get a real D-Day experience when you're playing as the U.S. troops on U.S. offensive on this map. You got to get off those Higgins boats. So hats off to that. That's all I have for you today. Have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.